I mean, I think that reflects the attitude of the ANC and many senior officials towards the electorate, that they have a right to govern, and the electorate, they are the natural expression of the will of the people. We often hear that phrase, but in an electoral democracy, you need to make your case to the electorate. You need to say, this is what we're going to do for you. And as those living standards have started to decline, as growth is flatlined, people are starting to, I think, become very frustrated.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we have back with us David Ansara. David is the Chief Operating Officer at the Center for Risk Analysis. So, David, we've just had a historic local election where the ANC fell below 50%, I believe for the first time. From the results of this election, who would you say are the biggest winners and losers?
Well, Donald, I think one of the most striking aspects of this election is that there are no real clear winners per se. If you were a member of any one of the major political parties, I think you'd have cause to be somewhat disappointed by the results. Obviously, if you're a member of the ANC, I think you're going to be quite alarmed by that dip below the 50% threshold down to 46%. And when we speak about these election results, obviously, this is just the aggregation of all of the local government results. So what really matters is at the municipal level in each particular municipality or metro. But nevertheless, if you add up all the votes, ANC is just on 46%, which is an historic low for the party. But not very much better for the DA. I think they would be somewhat disappointed. They're down to 22%. I think it was about 21.8% was their final figure. So many council seats lost. They retained their stronghold in the city of Cape Town, albeit with a reduced majority, but lost Nelson Mandela Bay, their outright majority there. And so they didn't have an outright majority, but they were the largest party, but they've now slipped back. But I think this is an historic election in many respects, Donald, because I think it signifies a paradigm shift that is happening in South Africa. And in our post-election analysis, in our briefings, and in our reports, we have used the metaphor of a buffalo to describe where the ANC is at the moment. So imagine that you have this wise, grizzled old buffalo that has been dominating over the savannah for many, many years, decades, in fact, unchecked, unchallenged in terms of its electoral dominance. And there was always an assumption amongst the commentariat and analysts that one day a hungry young lion would come and challenge the supremacy of the buffalo and bring it down. And so many of these commentators often scan the savannah looking and hope for this new young lion, but the lion never materialized, never emerged. But what instead we're finding, and this local government election signifies this, is the emergence of a pack of wild dogs that has come along and is threatening the supremacy of the old buffalo, which is really on its last legs now. And wild dogs, if they can coordinate their activities, can be very powerful, but they're also prone to fighting with one another, nipping at each other. But if they can get and encircle this buffalo and snipe at its heels and tear at its flesh, it can actually lead to the collapse of the once mighty dominant buffalo. So that's the metaphor that we've been using. I think it's a very useful lens with which to look at party politics post the November 1st elections.
And I think another analogy perhaps would be to say people were looking for a Nelson Mandela 2.0. And your wild dog analogy, it's a perfect example of it's coalitions that are going to probably end the ANC. It's not a Nelson Mandela or a one party that's going to arise to strike the death blow. But would one of those chief wild dogs, would it be ActionSA? It seems like they have got a lot of traction in a place like Gauteng. Dr. Krookamp has actually predicted in 2024 that they will be the second largest party. Do you think ActionSA will be a real champion or a real opposition in 2024?
So ActionSA is the newest dog in the pack, and Herman Mashaba has a brand profile, the name recognition that I think other politicians perhaps lack, particularly in the city of Joburg. And I think what was very effective about what Mashaba and ActionSA did was focus on 6 municipalities in which they contested. Most of its energies were focused on Gauteng. And we at the Center for Risk Analysis have long advised that there exists in South Africa a broad sentiment, which you could perhaps call center-right or socially conservative, which hasn't really found expression in a formal way in terms of party support. So the ANC is very socialist and nationalist in its orientation. And because of the liberation dividend, also for at least the first couple of decades, essentially building up to around 2007, the ANC was able, through accelerated service delivery, the improvement of the living conditions of ordinary South Africans, to shore up a big electoral support that has been declining as many of its policy direction has turned again to the hard left. But there has never really been a political home for what we would call Black conservatives. And that's conservatives with a small c, people who tend to be quite religious. They want the best for themselves and their families. They're kind of generally sympathetic to business and to pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. And for whatever reason, they haven't been able to find a political home in the existing political parties. But now we have someone like Herman Mashaba, who is speaking that language, who's saying that enough is enough with ANC service delivery failures. We need much more action, less talk. And he himself comes from a very successful business background and is someone who also pulled himself up by his own bootstraps and is a self-made man. And so I think that personal profile, also some of his language around immigrants in South Africa, he's been, verging, I think, on xenophobic, dog whistling kind of rhetoric, which I think is potentially very dangerous. I think that there are many benefits to immigration. I think that countries do have a right to determine who can come in, but immigrants tend to bring a lot of skills, capital, economic opportunities. It's not a zero sum. But putting that aside, I think that Mr. Mashaba is tapping into something. The fact that he got about 16% in the city of Joburg, I think, is testament to that. And so now he's going to be playing a very key kingmaker role. And as we're recording on Tuesday, the 16th of November, there's coalition negotiations are ongoing. But I think what's really exciting about this is that now we're seeing real competitive democracy in action. We've had this single-party dominance system for a long time. There's a hegemon of the ANC really being essentially the only game in town. I think that this heralds a new era of pluralism, political competition, and I think is also good for the opposition itself and also for the DA. Even though they went backwards in this election, there's some very promising signs in this new political realignment for them, which we can unpack a little bit later.
Absolutely. Another dark horse that might capture this social conservative vote in 2024. What do you think of the chances of a person like Chief Justice Mogoeng, former Chief Justice Mogoeng?
Well, I'm not sure about the exact rules, but I have been told that justices of the Constitutional Court are not allowed to run for high office. So I think that would require some significant rule changes. I can't really speak to his intentions. I mean, he certainly seems to like the public limelight. But yeah, I would say that that's probably a bit of a counterfactual. Just on your earlier question, though, Donald, you said that could ActionSA become the second largest party in 2024? I think they've still got a long way to go. But, I think Mr. Mashaba is playing a long game. I think key to watch in 2024 would be Gauteng. So if Mashaba can leverage this opportunity to perhaps gain significant advantage in, for example, the city of Joburg, in coalition with the DA, you could see the beginnings of the potential to capture Gauteng in the provincial elections in 2024. And, if the ANC can be brought down to below 50% in the national and provincial elections in 2024, that could open up coalition scenarios as well at the national level. So I don't even think that Mashaba really needs to become the second largest party. As long as he has significant support that he can then leverage in a kingmaker role, I think that would be to his significant advantage. But look, it's still early days with ActionSA. Let's not get too excited. COPE made a big splash in 2009. I think they got about 8% in that election, and that just fell apart. Many people suggest because there were actual ANC saboteurs within its ranks. There were personality conflicts as well. So the key would be, can you actually build a sustainable institutional apparatus around the personality of the leader? You don't want to be too dependent on the vagaries or the individual preferences of one particular individual. So if you have significant other politicians with clean track record of governance and credible support amongst key constituencies, then you could start to say, okay, this is becoming much more of a significant structural presence in South Africa's politics. But I think there's a long road ahead for ActionSA.
I think perhaps there can be a conflict within the ActionSA between the so-called conservatives and the social democrats, because I don't know if a lot of people in ActionSA are as conservative as Herman Mashaba, especially on his immigration stance. But a person like Fikile Mbalula, the campaign manager for the ANC, he has said, and I found this quite arrogant of him to say on a ENCA video, he has said, the people who have stopped voting for the ANC in this election, they merely sent out a warning shot. They love the ANC, but they're going to come back in 2024. Isn't it a common conception that if people stop voting, that they will be very reluctant to vote for that party again, especially if nothing changes?
Yeah, so Donald, I think that reflects the attitude of the ANC and many senior officials towards the electorate, that they have a right to govern, and the electorate, they are the natural expression of the will of the people. We often hear that phrase. But in an electoral democracy, you need to make your case to the electorate. You need to say, this is what we're going to do for you. And as those living standards have started to decline, as growth is flatlined, people are starting to, I think, become very frustrated. But I think the key question there is around voter turnout. And this was an historically low voter turnout for South African elections. Generally, the number of registered voters tends to go up as the population increases. So we actually saw the number of registered voters go down. So essentially by around 100,000. So it's now sitting at around 26 million registered voters. But the voter turnout was only 11.8 million voters. So that's a 45% turnout. That is by far the lowest voter turnout we've ever had. 2016, it was about 57%. And so you have to ask, why are people staying at home? And there were COVID concerns, there was the long weekend, it was rainy in the Western Cape. All of those factors matter. I think the broader trend was that people are disaffected with the electoral process, that they feel that their vote doesn't matter, that there's a lack of accountability in the system, and that service delivery failures are ongoing. The IEC itself must share some of the blame here. They tried to postpone the elections. That went to the Constitutional Court. That was knocked down by the court. They then only had one registration weekend. in the build-up to the elections to get new voters in. So there wasn't the usual hype and build-up and marketing around registration, around voting day, etc. So all of these factors, COVID as well, combined, I think, to suppress voter turnout. And, that doesn't necessarily only negatively impact the ANC, although it did significantly. And we do see a difference in turnout between local government and national government elections. So we should expect that to be higher in the next election. It was very low already in the last national election in 2019. So, I think a lot will depend on the turnout there. And if the current trends continue, particularly the economic trends, I think we're going to see still a high degree of apathy. And, but if that group of people can be mobilized and excited to vote for a new entity, then we could see even bigger shifts in South Africa's politics. So our suspicion, although it's somewhat conjecture, is that a lot of historic ANC supporters are a bit reluctant to actively vote against the ANC. And they show their dissatisfaction by staying at home, because they still haven't quite brought themselves to that point where they want to vote for another opposition party, or they haven't been convinced. They still feel a sense of residual loyalty to the party. But that group can be mobilized to support somebody else, like a Herman Mashaba, who did well in places like Soweto and Jewel City and other places like that in Joburg. Then you could see some very big and fundamental shifts happening in South Africa's politics.
Absolutely. Do you know percentage-wise how many people voted for the ANC in this election, like of the entire South Africa? I believe in the previous interview you said that in 2019 about 26% of the entire South Africa voted for the ANC.
Oh, Donald, I don't have those figures in front of me, unfortunately, but I think it's a small fraction. But what I do have is, so there's the number of eligible voters. So that's anyone essentially over the age of 18. There are about 40 million in South Africa. But again, to repeat, there were only 11.8 million people who actually voted out of that 40 million who were eligible. So not everyone who's eligible actually registered. So that's about 29.5% of people above the age of 18 who voted. I don't have the calculations there for how that reflected in terms of ANC support, but it's obviously a very tiny fraction.
Yeah, I think one can easily say they've gotten way less than 26% this time around from the entire South Africa.
So some other stats here. So ANC aggregate support in the last election, 2016, the last local government election, was 53.9%. And so that's gone down to 45.6%. The number of people who voted for the party in 2016 for the ANC was 16 million last time in 2016. It's now 10 million. So they lost 6 million votes. Look, the general turnout, as we just discussed, was very low. But I think that tells you something. They went down from 176 councils in which they were leading to 167. And they basically lost about 600 council seats across the country. It went down by about 11% in terms of the number of council seats. So really hemorrhaged quite badly there.
So someone like Dr. Frans Cronje, who you obviously know, he likes to say that in each election so far, you could always combine the ANC and the EFF support, and you would get that 69 or 67 magical number. But it seems like this time around, that doesn't really work. The people who didn't vote for the ANC, they stayed home, or they voted for an different party. So it seems like the EFF has finally reached the ceiling. Would that be accurate to say?
Well, the EFF was the only party of the three major parties that grew, albeit modestly. They grew by 2%. So they're at 10%. But we consider the EFF and the ANC to be part of the same political tradition, the Charterist tradition, if you will. And the EFF is essentially almost like a splinter of the ANC. It's the old ANC Youth League, but for branding and strategy purposes decided to go on its own. But your point is very important. Together, the ANC and the EFF, the charterists, are only now at about 56%. So if you had to extrapolate that out to the national level, that has significant implications, particularly given the EWC debate. If you had to replicate these support levels at the national level, that would mean that they wouldn't be able to pass certain constitutional changes that require 2/3 majorities. Their legislative agenda would be frustrated in general. So I think that what's very interesting is that support for the socialist, African nationalist kind of orientation of policies is waning in South Africa. That's just not resonating with the electorate. And so this broad opposition bloc, so the other parties, the small parties, they got about 21%. The DA got 22%. So that's over 40% now of 43% of parties. I beg your pardon, 43% of support for parties that are not the EFF and not the ANC. So you can consider the EFF almost like the small calf of the buffalo. And so those wild dog parties, they come from very different kinds of ideological backgrounds. They represent different kinds of constituencies. And also often very localized issues. So if you consider, for example, the Patriotic Alliance, that tends to be supported by colored voters. They did very well in Eldorado Park in Joburg, in the Western Cape, in a number of small municipalities. Interestingly enough, they seem to be cozying up a little bit with the ANC. So it's not a guarantee that all of the wild dogs are actually going to cooperate with one another. But to cooperate with the ANC in these conditions, I think, is a grave strategic error. You might gain some short-term advantage by collaborating in some dusty dorp somewhere in the rural Western Cape. But long-term, that's going to be to your detriment. So in our analysis, we think this is an incredible opportunity for the wild dog parties to really come together. And you can be an evangelical Christian who supports the ACDP. You can be a traditional Zulu voter who supports the IFP. You could be a classical liberal who supports the DA. Maybe your sense of identity as an Afrikaans person, you feel that the Freedom Front Plus represents your interests and your right to speak the language of your choosing, or what have you. Whatever your motivation is, you can safely cast your vote for your party of your choice. But the real challenge is the ANC's misgovernance at the moment. And so strategically, those opposition parties have a strong burden of responsibility to put aside some of their egotistical differences, perhaps their ideological differences, and coordinate their activities. A very interesting historical example was something I did my master's thesis on, which was single party dominance and its decline in India. The Congress Party of India for 3 decades, 1947 to 1977, was the dominant political actor. Also had socialist economic policies, very protectionist industrial policy. Nehru was their kind of founding father of the Congress movement. He was very close with Mahatma Gandhi, and that liberation dividend was very strong. But as Congress Party started to collapse and unwind, the very first election where they were defeated was a kind of a rainbow coalition of all these different types of parties. It didn't last very long, only about 18 months, that new multi-party government, but it broke that sense of invincibility that the Congress Party had. And fast forward to today, Congress is a shadow of its former self. The BJP is now the dominant political entity there. India's politics is still very fragmented and chaotic, but very competitive as well. So I think what we're moving towards is I really think that this is going to be the last time where we see one party getting more than 50%. You might get in the high 40s or the low 40s or even in the 30s. But this greater fragmentation, I think very unlikely to see one party getting the majority of all votes in South Africa in the future, just given the makeup of our society and the various different constituencies and interests that we have. And I think that's a very good thing.
It seems like on the talk of coalitions that Ramaphosa is not really willing to do a coalition with the EFF. Can it be attributed to the fact that perhaps they figured out that because they were trying to focus on EFF policies, that is why they were punished, and perhaps that is not the way to go?
Well, look, it's going to be very difficult for Mr. Ramaphosa to go on an investor roadshow or host an investor conference and say confidently that this is an investment-friendly destination if behind the scenes he's in a coalition with the EFF, which espouses radical Marxist-Leninist policies of expropriation and nationalizing the Reserve Bank and all those other crazy policies that they put forward. So I think that he would be keenly aware of the perception that would create. And, also throw it open to the other side. Would the EFF be interested in tethering itself to this party that is kind of on the decline, that's at a loss for how to improve the circumstances of South Africans, that has kind of run out of ideas and is on its way down? They might think better to go it alone as the EFF rather than attach themselves.
Do you think that is sorry? Do you think that's why they basically made impossible conditions to go in a coalition with the ANC?
Well, look, I mean, I think they're going to want to leverage any support that they can utilize at the local level in order to achieve their broader national goals, particularly around EWC. There's a bit of a stalemate in Parliament at the moment over this issue of custodianship. But yeah, I think in many ways, if you set these impossible aspirations, these supposedly non-negotiables, then maybe that is intentional. I don't know. I can't read the minds of the EFF strategists, but perhaps that is something that they are considering, that put impossible conditions on the table, and then and when the talks break down, then you can just point your fingers to your opponents. But yeah, I think the key areas to watch are going to be Ekurhuleni, eThekwini. The EFF did pretty well there in both of those places. So will the ANC and EFF be able to collaborate? I think that'll be a very interesting test case to see if their shared ideological leanings do translate into cooperation at the local government level. I think that'll be a very telling indicator of where sentiment lies within both parties.
David, what do you think of these coalition agreements that the EFF has proposed, where essentially the ANC takes Ekurhuleni, the EFF takes Tshwane, and ActionSA takes Johannesburg? Isn't that very undemocratic, especially if only 10% of the people voted for the EFF in Tshwane?
Yeah, I think it shows again the attitude of the EFF to the electorate, that support is basically something that is your divine right, and you can not really care too much about the mandate that you get from the electorate. That power is just something to be bargained and fought over with your opponents. I don't think that the EFF really fully embodies a democratic spirit. It's a highly centralized, militant organization that is pretty ruthlessly organized. And I don't really think that fundamentally it is a democratic party. I think it is a highly centralized and self-professed Marxist-Leninist organization with a very radical agenda, which sees democratic institutions as instruments for advancing its own power interests rather than goods in and of themselves. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think it shows a contempt for the democratic process, and I think also quite arrogant to assume that if you've got 10% of the vote in Tshwane, that you can then take the mayoralship on that very slim mandate. So yeah, I think overall, the EFF, I think, would also be disappointed by this election. I think, given the media profile that they've had and their ability to kind of dictate terms in Parliament with the ANC and EWC, I think they would be somewhat disappointed by this showing, even though they made some gains in places like Ekurhuleni and eThekwini.
It's probably safe to say that Johannesburg and Pretoria or Tshwane will go to this new coalition talks that have been set up by the Freedom Front Plus, the coalition between the Freedom Front Plus, ActionSA, the Democratic Alliance, and a small number of smaller parties.
Yeah, I'm not sure why the media reporting emphasized Freedom Front Plus there. I'm sure they're playing an active role, but I suspected that perhaps there was a way of some elements of the media delegitimizing these new broader coalitions. And yeah, look, I think there will be a lot of horse trading. I mean, we were very critical a moment ago of the EFF, but I'm sure there's going to be a lot of similar kinds of bargaining. You'll take Tshwane, we'll take Joburg kind of discussions happening there as well. But yeah, I mean, I think those parties together perhaps have a larger mandate, and arguably that could be more justifiable. But I think something to bear in mind, Donald, is that I don't think service delivery is necessarily going to improve dramatically under these coalitions. Many people might say, well, the effects of ANC misgovernance are so pronounced that even a very unstable coalition could only do better. But, you're also, I think, going to see a lot of problems with lack of capacity. Bear in mind also that a number of civil servants who work in these city administrations are deployed cadres of the ANC. They're going to be very keen to keep their patronage channels open. It's going to be difficult to enforce accountability, performance metrics, and so on. Governments are going to collapse at a moment's notice. Some will be very unstable. Might even see by-elections triggering the fall of a government, new elections being called. It's going to be very chaotic and unstable. But I think these are transitory pains. South Africa is going to have to get used to managing and dealing with coalitions, and this is all part of a maturing democracy such as ours.
So if I know Ramaphosa's position is if they can't cobble together a coalition, he wants to hold more elections in these areas where they can't get a coalition going with one of the smaller parties. Can't that keep on going indefinitely? Right? I mean, if you don't have a coalition in the second election, will he hold a third election, a fourth election? When is it going to stop?
So I think the person to ask about that would be my colleague Marius Ruitt, who's much more of an elections nerd than I am. I think you can hold by-elections if you aren't able to form a government. Also, one tool that the ANC might use is taking cities under administration, particularly opposition-held cities. And we saw this in Tshwane with the DA minority government there. And the DA actually went to court to reverse that decision. So that was when the provincial administration took over essentially the running of the city. So there's going to be a lot of dirty tricks like that. And I think that is a constitutional provision. So I think some legal minds are going to have to apply themselves to when is that legitimate to do that and when not. But yeah, I think I wouldn't be surprised if the ANC attempts to do that, to try and get new mandates on an ongoing basis when the results don't suit them.
Yeah, well, thank you, David, for your wise and thorough analysis. Any last words, anything you want to say before we end the show?
Well, Donald, I think many of your viewers might already be familiar with our channel, the CRA channel. We have videos every weekday morning at 7 a.m. So that's clips of our webinars, interviews with outside experts, and also short pieces of analysis with our own CRA staffers. So do check that out. I've also got a podcast, which is every Sunday morning, called Solutions with David Ansara, where I have more in-depth conversations with leading thinkers about how to solve some of the world's most intractable problems. So I'm sure you'll put a link up to those as well. But yeah, anytime you want to have me on, I'll be happy to share my insights with you, Donald. I really appreciate the conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much, David. And to our viewers, you've certainly enjoyed the content. If you've made it this far, please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our YouTube channel. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.